Two of the most famous outlaws of the old American West were brothers. We begin their story on a cold day in February 1866.
Liberty, Missouri. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. "12 men on horses ride slowly into town. Their hats are low on their faces. They stop in front of the Clay County Savings Bank. 2 of the men get off their horses and enter the bank. The bank manager asks if he can help them. The 2 men pull out guns from under their heavy coats. They demand money. In less than 2 minutes, they return to the street. Now, the gang is in a great hurry. All 12 men begin shooting. Several people are wounded. A young college student is killed.
What happened on that day was the first bank robbery during business hours in peacetime in the United States. History books say the 2 men who went into the bank were Frank James and his younger brother Jesse. But this was never proved. Frank and Jesse James told lawmen they were home that day. Several of their friends confirmed the story. True or not, during the next 16 years, the James brothers did become 2 of the most famous outlaws in America.
History experts say they robbed at least 12 banks, perhaps many more. They stopped 7 trains, taking money from passengers and the United States Postal Service. They robbed as many as 7 stagecoaches, the horse-pulled vehicles used back then as public transportation. They traveled from their home in Clay County, Missouri, to Minnesota in the north, and to Texas in the west. Hundreds of lawmen hunted them, but the James brothers were never caught. Who were Frank and Jesse James? Why were they so famous?
Frank and Jesse were the sons of Robert James, a religious minister who owned a farm in Clay County, Missouri. People who knew the family said the James boys were polite and friendly, at least until the time of America's Civil War. Many people in Missouri believed in the cause of the Southern or Confederate states during the Civil War. However, Missouri was on the border between the North and the South. Almost as many people there supported the Union as the Confederacy. Terrible fighting took place in Missouri and in other border states. Guerrilla groups from both sides were responsible for the fighting.
History experts say much of the violence in the American West was a result of the situation after the Civil War. Many former Confederate soldiers returned home, but did not put down their guns. They continued to fight what they saw as symbols of Northern oppression. These included banks and railroads. Many local people agreed with the former soldiers and supported them. A lack of government control in the West also led to increased violence after the war. Records show that violent crime increased at that time by as much as 50%.
Frank and Jesse James are perhaps the most famous examples of the soldier-turned-outlaw. During the Civil War, the James family suffered attacks by Union guerrillas. As a way of fighting back, Frank and Jesse became Confederate guerrillas. They rode with two of the most violent guerrilla groups. After the war, they continued their violent ways. The James brothers were extremely successful. Their gang rode for 16 years. Hundreds of government lawmen tried to catch them. Agents of the private Pinkerton National Detective Agency tried too. But no one did. Most lawmen did not even know what the two brothers looked like.
Jesse James enjoyed being famous. He often wrote letters to newspapers denying that he was guilty of any crime. Once he ate dinner with a well-known Pinkerton detective who was searching for him. The detective got a big surprise later when he opened a letter from Jesse James. Jesse said how much he enjoyed their dinner together. He also wished him good luck. Stories like this were printed in newspapers all over the country. They helped make the James brothers famous. People liked the stories. Those who had been robbed did not. Soon, large amounts of money were offered for the capture of Frank and Jesse James. The state of Missouri offered as much as $10,000 for the brothers, dead or alive.
It was easy for the James brothers to hide in their home area. Yet, most often, they hid in large cities. Many years later, Frank James told reporters that it was easy to hide in a city because everyone there looked like everybody else. When one place became too dangerous, the James brothers moved to another. That was one reason they decided to go to Minnesota. There, they planned to rob the bank in the town of Northfield. Frank and Jesse rode to Northfield with 6 friends. 3 of the friends were brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger. Like the James brothers, the Youngers were former Confederate guerrillas, now outlaws.
From the beginning, their attempted robbery of the bank in Northfield was a failure. First, when Jesse demanded money from bank workers, they said the safe could not be opened. Next, the gang decided to get out of town fast. But the people of Northfield knew something was wrong. Many had gone to their homes or offices for their guns. Then the shooting began. 2 members of the gang were killed in town. Another was killed later. And Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger were captured. Only 2 men escaped, Frank and Jesse James. Frank was wounded, but he stayed on his horse. Lawmen chased him and his brother for more than a week before they lost their trail. In the years that followed, the James brothers tried again to form another gang. They were never very successful.
In 1882, Jesse James was living in St. Joseph, Missouri, with his wife and children. People knew him as Mr. Howard. One day, another outlaw, Bob Ford, shot him in the back of the head. He killed Jesse James for the money that had been offered for his capture. Bob Ford never collected the money. He was tried for murder instead. Several months later, Frank James surrendered to the governor of Missouri. He was charged with several crimes and tried 2 times. Both juries refused to find him guilty.
Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger spent many years in prison for their part in the Northfield, Minnesota raid. After Cole was released from prison, he and Frank James earned money by speaking to groups. They told about their days as outlaws and the evils of crime. Frank James lived to be 72 years old. He died in the same room in which he was born, on the James family farm in Clay County, Missouri. Today, that farmhouse is a museum that tells the story of the 2 most famous outlaws of the American West.